Now that we have touched based on how our data will be structured, we'll now focus on working on the endpoints. In the first lesson, we mentioned that endpoints are the channels or the way in which our Flutter application will interact with the server through the client. So for endpoints, for us to create in our classes, the classes that we're going to create, our endpoints should extend the endpoint class. So for the methods to be generated, that the methods we're going to create, they will need to return a type future. So all our functions will have the future type. And the first argument will always be the session object. This object holds information about the call being made and provides access to the database. So let's begin. We'll head over to the server folder and head over to lib src endpoints. Already there's an existing one. We'll create our first one, user endpoint.dat, which will include all the functions revolving around the user table. So our class name will be called user endpoint and we'll extend the endpoint class. Inside it, we're going to create our first function, and every function has a type future. So we're going to create a user and return the type user. So then we'll pass the first argument as the session object. Then the next one will be our user object. Will contain information about the user, and all we have to do is use the insert method and pass our session and the user object, and we're done. Next, we're going to create a function that gets user by ID. So we'll return the user object. We'll pass the session object, and then we will pass the user ID. So you can use that to get the information of a specific user. So we'll use user.find by ID and just pass the user ID, and then we will return the user. So we'll put handle the null in case we don't get that specific user and return our user. Great. Next thing, we're going to create the workspace endpoint.dat file, which will hold all the functions revolving around the workspace class. So we'll create our class name as workspace endpoint, extend the endpoint class, and create our first function, which will be create workspace, which will pass the session object and the workspace class, which will hold the information of a specific workspace. And inside it, we're going to use the insert method to insert our workspace object. Great. And return the information so that the returned workspace will come in with the ID that has been generated for that specific workspace or that row that has been inserted. Next, we're going to create a function that gets workspace by user. So each user has their own list of workspaces. So we're going to get that using the user ID. So to do that, we're going to create a variable that holds the list or list of workspaces, and we're going to use the find method, pass the session, and define our where. So we're going to get user ID, list of workspaces where the user ID is equivalent to the user ID in our argument function. And then if you recall, in our workspace, we had a field called members. So we also want to return the members of each specific workspace. So to do that, we're going to do a for loop. For every workspace, we'll head over to the member table and get members where the workspace ID is equivalent to the ID of that specific workspace in the loop. m.workspace ID dot equals workspace of index I dot ID. So specify list of member, and then we're going to assign each workspace. So workspace index I dot member is equals to members. Great. And then we return our workspaces. Next, we're going to create a function that gets a workspace by ID. So we get information of a specific workspace by passing the workspace ID, and then we return the workspace. Pass await. Great. So with that, we're going to create a function that updates, get the boards of a specific workspace by passing the workspace ID. So we'll enter our session object and pass our workspace ID. Using the workspace ID, we'll head over and check on the table board and check where the workspace ID is equivalent to the workspace ID passed in the argument, so that you can get the list of boards of that specific workspace and return boards. Great. Next, we're going to create a function that updates a workspace. So all you have to do is pass the session object and your workspace object, and then run the session.db.update and pass the workspace in our argument. And lastly, we're going to create a function that deletes a workspace by passing the session object and our workspace object, and we just run workspace.delete delete row workspace. Sorry, yes. So those are all the functions revolving around the workspace. Next, let's create the board endpoint. So our class name will be board endpoint, extends endpoint class. So our first function will be create board, where we'll return the board object. We'll pass our session argument and our board object, and then we're going to just call the board class and just use a insert method to insert our board object. Next, we are going to create a function that updates our specific board that we pass in the argument. So all we have to do is use the session.db.update and pass our board object. Great. Next, we're going to create the delete board as well. Having passed the board object, we just run the board class dot delete row and pass our board object. Great. The next thing is we want to get workspace for a specific board. So this is an additional function that we are adding. So once we've passed our board in the argument, we just want to use the workspace class and find a single row where the workspace ID is equals to, we get the workspace ID from the board object. So we'll get all the information about the workspace that the board is in. I hope it makes sense. Next, let's create let's listboard endpoint dot dat. So our class will be listboard endpoint, extends the endpoint class. So our first function we're going to get a list of lists that a specific board has. So we're going to pass in the board ID and get all the lists that are inside that specific board. So we referred where the list I'm talking about, Trello refers it to list, but here in our project we have defined it as a list board so that we do not conflict with the list data type in that. So then we just use the find method and check where where the board ID is equals to the board ID that has been passed in the argument, and we also want to specify the cards. So we're going to run let's see, we hadn't defined the list variable name, so we're just going to run our for loop as we did previously. For all our list, we want to go and pick the cards that are inside that list using the card class. And with the method find, we're able to specify a condition where the list ID in a card is equivalent to the list of index i.id. And then we're going to add it. List index i.cards is equals to the cards that we have received. And then now we return our lists. Great. Next, we're going to create a list. So we pass our list object, our list board object. And then we just use the list board class to insert our object. And then we return our list so that we can get now the object with its ID. The ID is what creates the uniqueness. Now in our card endpoint.dat, we're creating a class for all the functions revolving around the card. So first we're going to create a function that creates a card, and we're going to pass our session object and our card object. And then we're going to pass a way to use the card class and the method insert to add our object and return our object. Then we're going to update our card by passing the arguments as session object and the card object. And we just use a session to update our card object. Yes, correct. Next, we're going to focus on our members. So in our class of member endpoint extends our endpoint class. Then we'll just create a function that adds a member. And just use the member class and the insert method to insert our object. Great. So we want to create a situation where we want to provide a list of members for a specific workspace. To do that, with the workspace ID, we just go to our member class and use the find method using the and define where m.workspace ID is equals to the workspace ID in our argument, and then we return our members. Great. So there comes a time where we want to get a member information. So remember I mentioned that the members in the member table have to be users. So they have to exist in the users table, and the users table is where we have more information about this member. So you find in the member table, it's mainly parent-child relationships IDs. So if you want to get to know more, we use the user ID in the member ID and check it in the user table to get now the name, the email address, the handle, and the like. So that's what we're doing. So just create a list users is equals to. Know that here we're actually not getting the information of a specific member, but of members. So we'll get a list of members, and then we're going to do a for loop and now find information of each and push it in a list of type user called users. Great. Next, we're going to create a function of type future workspace where we will delete a specific member from the workspace. So we have three arguments: the session object, the member object, and the workspace object. So we use the delete method in the member class and define our where m.workspaceid equals to workspace.id, and where m.id equals to member.id. Great. We just add the members to the member star, and then we return it. So we have the activity table as well. So let's just create a class for it. Extends endpoint. We just want to create activity. So we want to log our activities and have them inserted in the activity table. So as usual, we just call the activity class and use the method insert. This is the power of ORM. If you recall, we talked about it in our first lesson. Then we have attachment. So in this project, we actually separating the entities in different files. But if you want to, you can also create one specific file, that file where you'll add all your functions inside. That's also an option. So we're going to create a function that creates an attachment or adds an attachment. So it passes the session object and the attachment object. Then we just use the attachment class and the insert method and just pass the attachment object and return the attachment object. Great. Then we have the checklist endpoint.dat, We'll do the same thing, create a class for it and extend the endpoint class. Then we're going to create a function that will create a checklist. Await checklist.insert, and we pass the checklist object. We also want to update the checklist. So the way the checklist will look like, it will have a checkbox, then a text, right? So if you check that you've actually completed, it should update the status of that specific checklist. So all we're doing is passing the checklist object and then using the session to update. Great. And then we also have a situation where we want to delete the checklist in a specific card. So we're going to add that function as well. And we'll use the checklist class to call the delete method and pass our checklist object. Yep. Then we have the comment endpoint.dart. So we create our class, extend our endpoint class, and create our function. Create a function that will create a comment. So when a comment is inserted, this is a function that we'll call to insert it into the comment table. Then we'll use a comment class to call the insert method and pass our comment object, then return our comment object, which will come back with an ID field. Then we also want to update our comment, delete our comment. So we'll just pass the session object and the comment object, and then we just use the comment class to call the delete row method and pass our comment object. And basically we are done with all our endpoints. These are all the endpoints that we're going to interact with. I hope I have explained in a simple and clear way. So all we're just doing is just running the Serverpod generate to make sure that the client has the latest information from the server side, because next we're going to interact with the client now.